a place where the quietest moments can speak the loudest. Have you ever seen a child who doesn't speak, not because he can't, but because the world hasn't yet reached him? Today's story begins with the hum of violin strings, and ends with something no one expected. A boy learning, for the first time, what it means to feel alive. If you believe that sometimes, the most powerful connection doesn't come through words, but through presence, stay with us, because today, a father will witness his son hear something for the very first time. Not with his ears, but with the tips of his fingers. The theater was smaller than Edward expected. Nestled quietly off a narrow street in downtown St. Paul, Minnesota, the building looked like it had once been a church. High arched windows, red brick faded with time, and a wooden sign that read "Sensory Strings, a concert for the extraordinary." There was no red carpet, no grand entrance, no camera flashes. Just a line of parents, some holding the hands of children who didn't speak, others pushing wheelchairs, all carrying the same cautious hope in their eyes. Edward Langford stepped out of the black town car in his usual dark gray suit. He looked every inch the billionaire insurance mogul the world knew him to be: polished shoes, gold cufflinks, tailored overcoat. But his shoulders sagged with something heavier than age. He opened the door for his 10-year-old son, Eli, who didn't move. The boy sat motionless, clutching a worn piece of felt in his left hand. He didn't look up. He never did, not when they arrived anywhere new. Edward waited patiently, as he always did, before gently offering his hand. Eli didn't take it, but he did eventually slide out of the car, step by slow step, his sneakers barely making a sound on the icy sidewalk. Edward glanced toward the entrance. No crowd. No reporters. Good. He didn't come for attention. He didn't even come for results. He just needed one thing: that Eli wouldn't panic. The last time they tried attending a public music event, Eli had screamed within 30 seconds and buried himself under a coat. The sound, the light, the pressure of people, even the buzz of the overhead speakers, was too much. It had taken 2 therapists and 3 hours to calm him down. Edward had sworn off events after that. But this one was different. Or so he was told. Designed for children with sensory processing disorders, the invitation had read: quiet lighting, limited sound range, live performers trained in therapeutic interaction. It was a long shot. But Edward had flown them both here anyway, on a private jet, under a pseudonym, with no staff, no press, and no expectations. He glanced down at his son, whose blue eyes were fixed on the texture of the building's brick wall. Eli's fingers slowly tapped against the felt strip, back and forth in a rhythm no one else could understand. Edward had come to love that rhythm. It meant his son was calm, present. "Shall we?" he said quietly. Eli didn't answer. But he followed. Inside, the room was dim and warm. No harsh lights. Rows of plush chairs circled a small stage in the center, where a single violin lay resting on a stool. No microphones. No speakers. Just the hum of quiet breathing and the occasional squeak of a chair as someone adjusted themselves. Edward guided Eli toward a seat in the back row, far from the center, close to the exit. He sat down slowly, keeping one eye on his son. Eli stood for a while, swaying gently, eyes scanning the room without truly looking. Then cautiously, he perched on the edge of the chair, still clutching his felt. Edward let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Around them, other parents murmured soft encouragements to their children. Some kids rocked, some flapped their hands, some simply stared. But no one judged. No one shushed. It felt, oddly, safe. Then, a soft voice came over a speaker. A woman. Calm. Steady. Welcome. Today's concert is not about performance. It's about presence. For the next 20 minutes, you will hear live strings designed to soothe, not startle. If your child needs to move, let them. If they want to come closer, that's okay too. The lights dimmed further. The stage remained empty, until a woman stepped out. She was in her 30s, Edward guessed. Long auburn hair tied loosely back. No makeup, no glitter, just a pale blue sweater and loose black pants. She walked like someone who had learned to move gently, as if even her footsteps were aware of the space they entered. She picked up the violin and held it, not high, not like a virtuoso preparing to dazzle, but low humbly. Then she drew the bow softly across one string. It was barely a note. More a breath. Eli flinched. Edward tensed, but Eli didn't bolt. Instead, the boy's eyes slowly moved toward the stage. Another note. This time slightly fuller. The woman didn't look at anyone directly, but her presence filled the space. Her fingers glided like she was speaking to each child through the air. Eli was still now. The felt was in his lap. His hands rested on the armrest. And for the first time in Edward's memory, his son was simply listening. Not covering his ears. Not retreating into himself. Not rocking. Just sitting. Edward dared not breathe. He watched as the bow moved again. And again. The music wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was slow, uneven, exploratory. But in that moment, it was the only sound Edward wanted to hear. He looked at his son. And for a single heartbeat, he allowed himself something dangerous. Hope. Amelia didn't speak. She didn't ask questions, didn't reach out, didn't coax. She simply knelt beside the stool where her violin now rested, its strings still humming faintly from the last soft notes of the concert. Her movements were deliberate but gentle, like she had done this before, many times. Not on stage, but in quieter, more sacred spaces. She lowered the violin so that its body faced outward, closer to the level of a small child's reach. Edward watched from a distance, still seated, his hands clenched together. He knew this part of the event was called Feel the Strings, but he hadn't expected them to stay this long. He hadn't expected Eli to stay this long. The boy was standing now, just a few feet from Amelia, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the violin. His hands hovered in front of him, fingers curling and uncurling. Amelia remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't offer encouragement. She simply held the violin as if it had always belonged to that moment, and let silence fill the rest. Eli stepped forward. Very slowly. His sneakers made no sound on the carpeted floor, but Edward could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Eli didn't make eye contact. He never did. But his gaze dropped to the strings, and his right hand extended with the same hesitation he used when exploring new textures: water, grass, fabrics, things that moved or pulsed or trembled. And then, his fingertip touched the A string. At the same moment, Amelia gently drew her bow across it. A low, soft vibration sang out, not loud, not sharp. Just enough. Eli's entire body jolted. Edward nearly stood, but stopped himself. His son hadn't flinched away. He hadn't pulled back. Instead he stood still, his arm hovering, eyes wide. He looked, startled. Not frightened. Like something had reached him. Through skin. Through nerve. Through something deeper. Amelia didn't say a word. She simply reset her bow, waited, and let the moment breathe. Eli moved again. His hand rose, more confidently this time, and touched a different string. This time, his index and middle fingers rested together on the metal. Amelia responded, bow gliding once more. The note that came out was barely audible, but the vibration rippled through the boy's fingers, his wrist, up his arm. He didn't move away. He touched again. And again. Each time she followed him, never leading, only answering. It wasn't music in the traditional sense. It wasn't teaching, either. It was something else. A conversation without words. Edward leaned forward in his seat. His throat was tight. I'd never seen him do that, he would later say. My son doesn't repeat actions. He doesn't mimic. He doesn't engage twice with the same object or person. But that day, he did. He repeated the touch. Not once. Not twice. He kept going. With every brush of his fingers against the strings, he lingered just a little longer. His breathing steadied. His posture straightened, as if drawn upward by something inside the sound itself. And Amelia remained a constant presence, responding each time without altering her pace. She didn't try to turn it into a performance. She didn't try to interpret what he was doing. She just let it happen. The room around them faded. Parents watched from the edges, holding their breath. No one dared move. Even Edward, who had lived a lifetime in boardrooms, in negotiations, in million-dollar conversations, felt smaller in that moment. Not because he was powerless, but because something sacred was unfolding in front of him, and all he could do was witness it. Eli was touching music. Not hearing it. Not playing it. Feeling it. For the first time, Edward realized his son wasn't unreachable. Just unreached. And this woman, this violinist with a quiet voice and a healing hand, had reached him, not with science, not with therapy, but with a single shared vibration. It was enough to shake something loose in Edward's chest, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope. The room remained still, almost reverent. No one gave instructions. No one interrupted. Even the ambient noises, the shifting of chairs, the quiet murmurs of other children, seemed to pause as if the entire space had aligned itself around one extraordinary connection. Amelia continued playing. Not melodies. Not songs. Just simple, short strokes of her bow across the strings, gentle, barely audible vibrations that rose and fell like a whisper on skin. And Eli, he responded. Each time a note trembled from the strings, his fingers reached out. Not in mimicry, but in dialogue. He touched the violin with the care of someone rediscovering a forgotten language. His hands moved lightly over the wooden body, across the strings, sometimes pausing, sometimes trailing off. It was almost as if he was trying to memorize what sound felt like. Not what it meant, not how it worked, but how it lived beneath his fingers. Amelia did not rush him. She let the silence stretch between them, like breath. She played only when he touched, only when he was ready. Every gesture from her was an invitation, never a demand. She wasn't performing. She was answering. And Eli, he was leading the conversation. Edward stood still, afraid that even shifting his weight would break the spell. He had watched his son for 10 years, watched him curl inward, flinch at the world, reject contact, avoid rhythm. Music had always been a torment. Too many pitches. Too many vibrations that hurt instead of soothed. Therapists had tried metronomes, weighted vests, vibroacoustic chairs, noise-canceling headphones. Nothing ever got through. But now, here was his son, moving in sync with another human being, without resistance, without fear, without pulling away. Not only in sync. In harmony. Amelia played a soft G string. Eli pressed his palm flat on the body of the violin, eyes closed. When she shifted to a lighter A note, his fingertips moved to trace the vibration along the neck. And when she paused, he waited, not in confusion, but in recognition. Like he understood the pause wasn't the end, it was just part of the music. It wasn't learned behavior. It was instinct. It was connection. Edward felt something uncoil in his chest. A kind of ache, old and familiar, tightened behind his ribs. He hadn't cried in years. Not when his wife passed. Not during Eli's diagnosis. Not after the hundreds of hours in clinics, the $1,000 consultations, the endless stacks of reports that all said the same thing: your son is unreachable. But now, standing in the back of this quiet theater, watching his boy press his cheek softly against the side of a violin, his hand resting alongside a woman who had said nothing and demanded even less, Edward broke. Silent tears slid down his face. No sobs. No shaking shoulders. Just water from a place he thought had dried out long ago. It wasn't just the beauty of the moment. It was the absence of struggle. There was no trying here. No therapy session. No agenda. Only two people, one playing, one feeling, and something between them that no textbook could explain. Amelia didn't glance back at Edward. She didn't acknowledge the audience at all. Her entire being was centered on the child before her. Every tilt of the bow, every pause of her hand, was guided not by instruction, but by intuition. And Eli, he followed like he'd always known how. Edward remembered every expert who had told him what Eli would never do. He'll never respond to music. He'll never tolerate physical contact. He'll never connect emotionally through sensory input. They were wrong. Because here, in this moment, with no plan and no pressure, his son wasn't just responding. He was expressing. Without words. Without training. Just through fingertips and resonance. And the woman who unlocked it all had done so not with knowledge, but with patience. Edward wiped his cheek and didn't bother hiding the tears anymore. This wasn't a miracle. It was something rarer. It was understanding. The theater had emptied slowly. Parents filed out with their children, some quiet, some restless, some humming fragments of something they couldn't quite name. But Edward stayed behind, standing just beyond the final row of chairs, watching as Amelia carefully packed away her violin. She moved without rush. Every motion was quiet, intentional. The same calm that had guided her through Eli's moment still lingered around her like a gentle current. Edward waited until the last family had left before approaching. "I'm not usually the type to linger," he said, his voice low, hesitant. Amelia looked up, surprised but not startled. She gave him a polite nod and gently placed the violin case on the edge of the stool. He walked closer, the leather soles of his shoes making the softest scuff against the theater floor. That was, he paused. Words, usually his allies in boardrooms and negotiations, failed him now. It was something I've never seen before. She didn't fill the silence. She only listened. He swallowed hard. "My son, Eli, he doesn't repeat actions. He doesn't respond to people. And he certainly doesn't sit through 20 minutes of anything without withdrawing into himself." Amelia offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "But today he did." "Yes." Edward exhaled. "Today he did." He looked down, hands in his coat pockets, suddenly aware of how out of place he seemed here. Everything about this space was soft, its light, its sound, its people. He was all edges and structure. But then he looked up again, and something broke through. "I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars," he said. "Therapists. Specialists. Equipment, devices that vibrate, simulate sound waves, wrap the body in feedback loops. All designed to teach sensory connection through vibration." Amelia watched him carefully, saying nothing. He shook his head with a sad laugh. "But no one ever taught my son to feel music. Not like this. Not through his skin. Not with trust." She let that land. And then gently, she responded. "I don't teach music," she said. "I just let children know that sound doesn't always have to hurt." Edward blinked. It was such a simple sentence. But it undid something in him. He stepped closer, folding his arms, not in defense, but in thought. "You said nothing. You gave him no instructions. You let him lead. And he engaged. He touched the violin like it was something familiar, like it had always been waiting for him." Amelia nodded. "Because it had." Edward tilted his head. "You've done this before?" She shrugged slightly. "Every child is different. But yes. Some kids only need a quiet invitation. Not direction. Not correction. Just space." He took that in slowly. "I don't know what to call what I saw," he admitted. "It wasn't therapy. It wasn't a lesson. It was trust," she finished. He met her eyes. For the first time since the performance, his voice dropped to a more vulnerable register. I didn't think I'd ever see that from him. Not in that way. Not without tears or fear or someone intervening. Amelia looked down at her violin case, ran a hand across the worn leather. "You're not the only one who's been told to stop hoping," she said. "Doctors told me I'd never play again. I used to perform in front of thousands. After a nerve injury, I could barely lift a bow. I stopped everything. Cancelled tours. Moved back here. Started teaching in silence." Edward said nothing. She looked up again. "Turns out, children like Eli taught me something I'd forgotten. Music doesn't have to be loud to be heard. And connection doesn't require perfection." He stood there, quiet. Not analyzing. Not solving. Just feeling. And for a man who had built an empire on numbers and policies and risk analysis, that alone was a kind of miracle. "I never thought I'd say this," he murmured, "but I think today changed me more than it changed him." Amelia didn't answer that. She didn't have to. The theater was empty now. But something full remained between them. Not possibility. Understanding. 2 days had passed since the concert, but Edward Langford hadn't stopped thinking about it. Not just about the way his son had touched the violin, or how Amelia had responded without words. It was the feeling, an unfamiliar warmth that had settled in his chest and refused to leave. For years, his world had been composed of contracts, liabilities, clinical reports, and structured interventions. But that night in the small theater had shattered something inside him, in the best way possible. He found Amelia the same way he found most people, with resources. It wasn't hard. She wasn't hiding. She taught part-time at a local therapeutic arts center just outside the city. No website, no bio, no list of achievements, just a name on a shared bulletin board and a handwritten note taped to a door that read, "Quiet classes. Please knock softly." He did. Amelia opened the door herself. Her eyes widened with surprise, then settled quickly into their usual quiet watchfulness. "I wasn't expecting you," she said. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he admitted. She stepped aside, and he entered. The room was simple. Wooden floors, soft rugs, low shelves with textured toys, instruments, and cushions. It smelled faintly of cedar and tea. No fluorescent lighting. No distractions. He took a slow breath. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what happened between you and Eli. About what I saw. About what he felt." Amelia sat on the edge of a low bench, waiting. Edward stood across from her, his hands folded loosely in front of him. "I don't believe in coincidences," he said. "I never have. But I do believe in impact. And what you did, it wasn't a therapy session. It wasn't a performance. It was a moment that rewired something in him. And in me." She nodded slowly, not speaking. He continued. "I've started 100 programs in my career, philanthropic ventures, foundations, learning initiatives. But none of them ever started because of my son." Now her gaze lifted fully to meet his. "I want to build something," he said. "With you." Amelia's brow furrowed. "Build what?" "A program," Edward said. "An initiative that brings artists like you into rehabilitation centers, special education schools, trauma clinics. Places where children don't respond to traditional methods, where sound is overwhelming, or speech is too much. A space where they can feel music, the way Eli did. Where they're allowed to lead." Amelia blinked. Her voice was soft, hesitant. I'm not sure I'm the person for that." "You are." "I'm not fully healed," she said gently. "I can only play for a few minutes at a time. My wrist, it doesn't hold like it used to." Edward stepped closer. "That's more than enough," he said. "You gave my son 5 seconds that changed everything." Amelia looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of a nearby drum. "It wasn't just me." He was ready. He reached for something. And you didn't pull away, Edward said. No one else has ever given him that kind of room. She shook her head slightly. You could hire dozens of therapists, musicians, experts. I already have, he replied. None of them did what you did. Silence fell between them again, but it wasn't awkward. It was full of something unspoken, recognition maybe. Mutual understanding from two people who never quite expected to end up in the same room. Edward reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple folder. It's just a draft, he said. A proposal. We'd call it Touch of Sound. You'd be the director. You'd design the framework, lead the artist training, guide the philosophy. It won't be fast. Or perfect. But it will be real. And it will reach kids like Eli who the world thinks are unreachable. Amelia didn't open the folder. She stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. I haven't led anything in years. Edward's tone softened. You don't have to lead from the front. Just be the person who knows what it feels like. Amelia swallowed. What if I fail? He smiled. You already didn't. The room was quiet, peacefully so. It was the first pilot session of Touch of Sound, held in a modest therapy center just outside Minneapolis. No more than 6 children were present, each accompanied by a parent or aide. There were no fluorescent lights, no rigid instructions, no polished performances. Just rugs, soft light, low chatter, and instruments waiting to be felt rather than played. Amelia sat on a floor cushion in the center of the room. The violin rested gently against her shoulder, and she was surrounded by open space. No stage, no elevation, nothing to separate her from the children who might choose to approach. Eli was seated on the far side of the room. He hadn't spoken, of course. He never did. He didn't react when Amelia entered, didn't move when she tuned the strings, didn't flinch at the first faint notes that drifted softly into the air. But Edward watched him closely, from a chair against the wall. He had learned by now not to expect anything. He had learned to treasure the small signs, the flicker of focus in Eli's eyes, the slowing of his breathing, the way his fingers paused against the worn felt he still carried everywhere. Amelia drew the bow slowly. One note. Soft. Hollow. A low G that lingered like the hum of distant thunder. A pause. Then another note. Higher. Shorter. Barely enough to register unless you were listening with more than your ears. And then a third. Eli shifted. His fingers stopped moving. His head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Amelia didn't look up. She wasn't watching him, not directly. But her body language said everything. I'm here. I'm still. I'm ready. Eli rose. Edward froze in place. He'd seen his son walk away from so many things. People, places, moments that overwhelmed him or simply failed to reach him. But now, Eli was walking toward the center of the room. One slow step at a time. No one guided him. No one coaxed. And when he reached Amelia, he didn't hesitate. He knelt beside her, then gently, delicately, placed both of his small hands on the wooden body of the violin. His palms rested flat on either side of the instrument, one near the scroll, the other on the curved back of the body. His eyes remained down, unfocused. Amelia did not speak. She simply drew the bow again, once, twice. The strings vibrated beneath his fingers. Eli's eyes widened. He inhaled sharply, but didn't flinch. Instead, something in his face began to shift. At first, it was a softening of the eyes. Then the tiniest twitch of the lips. And finally, as the note faded into silence, he smiled. Not a grin. Not a reflex. A real, full, conscious smile. Like something inside him had opened, and light came out. Edward turned away suddenly. Not because he was embarrassed, but because he couldn't stop the tears that rushed forward with impossible force. He covered his mouth with one hand, his shoulders tightening, eyes brimming. The kind of tears that didn't need sound, only release. For years, he had wondered what his son looked like happy. And now he knew. The boy he had fought for, protected, worried over, and grieved for silently each night, was smiling. Because of a vibration. Because of a woman with a bow. Because of a space where no one demanded anything. Amelia continued to play. 3 more notes. Then silence. Eli didn't move his hands. He didn't look up. He simply leaned forward and rested his cheek against the wood. And he smiled again. There are moments in life when the world stops speaking in words, and starts speaking in something deeper. For Edward Langford, that moment came not through a therapist's report or a medical breakthrough, but through the fragile hum of a violin string. It wasn't science. It wasn't structure. It wasn't anything he could measure, track, or ensure. It was connection. The kind that doesn't require speech, or eye contact, or even understanding in the traditional sense. It only required presence. For 10 years, Edward had lived in a constant state of searching. For answers, for solutions, for professionals who could reach the unreachable boy sitting at the dinner table each night, silent and distant. He had the money, the access, the power to buy the best the world could offer. But nothing he paid for could give his son what Amelia had offered freely: space. Not space to improve. Not space to perform. Just space to exist, without pressure, without correction, without fear. And in that space, Eli had done something more powerful than speak. He smiled. It was easy in Edward's world to believe that connection only happened through comprehension. That progress meant measurement. That expression required form. But what Eli taught him, what Amelia reminded him, is that some of the most powerful conversations happen in silence. You don't need to hear with your ears to know you're alive. You don't need to speak with your mouth to be understood. And you don't need to understand music technically to feel it resonate deep within your bones. Amelia hadn't taught Eli to play violin. She hadn't even tried. What she did was more radical. She trusted him to lead. She placed the instrument within reach and let him decide whether or not to touch it. She allowed him to experience sound not as a threat, but as something safe, something curious, something worth exploring. For children like Eli, the world is often too loud, too bright, too fast, too demanding. And for people like Edward, the instinct is often to shield, to fix, to control. But sometimes, the greatest gift is not a solution. It's an invitation. Amelia's music didn't demand anything. It simply said, "You're welcome here, exactly as you are." And that changed everything. Edward had spent a lifetime being listened to. In boardrooms. In courtrooms. In the media. But the moment he watched his son rest his cheek against a violin, he realized that real listening wasn't about sound, it was about attention. True connection means giving someone the freedom to be seen without being pushed. To be heard without having to perform. To feel safe without needing to prove anything. It's easy to forget, in a world full of noise, that stillness is sometimes the most healing force of all. And that's what this experience had taught him, not just as a father, but as a human being. That music is not always about performance. That sound is not always about volume. That growth does not always begin with goals. Sometimes, it begins with trust. The trust to offer something delicate, knowing it might be dropped. The trust to wait in silence, knowing you might not be answered. The trust to place a violin in front of a child who might never play it, and believe that the act of offering is enough. Amelia hadn't healed Eli. She had simply shown him that sound could be kind. And Edward, in turn, had learned that healing doesn't always look like transformation. Sometimes, it's one moment. One vibration. One smile. The kind of moment you carry for the rest of your life. Because when someone who has never looked up finally lifts their eyes to meet yours. When someone who has never smiled does so with their whole face. You don't forget. And you don't need to understand why it happened. You just need to be grateful that it did. In the end, no one remembered the exact notes she played. There was no video, no standing ovation, no applause. But something had shifted. A boy who once recoiled from sound now leaned into it. A man who had spent years searching for answers finally stood still long enough to see one unfold. Amelia never claimed to be a healer, or a teacher in the traditional sense. What she offered was far more rare: permission. Permission to feel without fear. Permission to explore without being corrected. Permission to simply be. And maybe that's why it worked. Because while others had tried to teach Eli how to behave, how to speak, how to catch up, Amelia gave him something they never did: the chance to feel music not as an assignment, but as a refuge. And in that quiet room, with no spotlight and no script, one truth became clear. She didn't teach him to play. She taught him to feel. If you've ever believed that music is something only meant to be heard, remember this: for some, music is the only thing that reminds them they're not invisible. Where quiet moments speak the loudest. And share with us. When was the last time you felt music? Not with your ears, but with your entire being.